Here on BBC Two, a fascinating hunt is on offer, a search for the truth about the lives of ancient Egyptians, led by Chronicle.
Six years ago, in a film called Revelations of a Mummy, Chronicle showed you the dissection of an unknown mummy at Manchester Museum. The mummy was in poor condition. It was no use for display. Anything that could be discovered by scientific means was bound to be of value.
Oh, it's fine. Go on. Just move up that way. It's fine. Lovely.
The work done at that time has now been expanded. At the museum, new non-destructive techniques have been developed. The entire Egyptian collection is under scrutiny.
Now, the head's rotated. It's a nice mummy, isn't it?
There's guilt on the face.
Yeah. I think it's going to be very interesting, this one.
That's cracked.
Lips.
There are many disciplines involved. Dr. Richard Fawcett and Hilary Jarvis use X-ray equipment to help the investigation.
Some hair.
He is intact.
I wonder what he's got in his
Nose
eyes.
Nose is blank.
I wonder whether he's got actual eyeball in there or whether it's packing.
Such a sad expression.
The head of the project is Dr. Rosalie David.
The various techniques give us a lot of information about life in ancient Egypt. The mummy investigation tells us about the disease, in some cases the cause of death in some of the mummies. It adds information about their funerary beliefs, their daily diet, and the process of mummification itself, which has been used in each case.
It's not just corpses that merit investigation. All the objects in the Manchester Museum can tell us something new, especially those from a village called Cahun, where much of the collection came from.
In the Cahun project, we're looking for rather more specific things, the technology of the tools which were used there, and the original provenance of the materials in the metal tools and in the pottery. So here we have specific things we are investigating.
The objects from Cahun are touchingly simple, still almost useful. These knives and this stool were everyday objects that were used by the people who made them 4,000 years ago. They are not objects from the tombs, but it is the tombs of the ancient Egyptians, rich and poor, that tell us most about the way they lived and died. The greatest monuments in Egypt, the pyramids at Giza, were built to immortalize the pharaohs. The sense of awe which they inspire survives the crowds of hawkers, peddlers, touts and tourists who surround them by day and by night. The smaller tombs in the area are also revealing. The wall paintings and sculptures give context to the objects in the museum at Manchester. Near the Great Pyramid is the tomb of a queen. Rosalie David was visiting it for the first time. The queen was called Meres Ankh, she who loves life.
Her name is repeated all the way around the tomb. Here it's above on the door lintel, and it says that she is the king's daughter of his body and also the king's wife. It's unique in design, and of course it's interesting to see a queen's tomb with scenes which then occur later in the tombs of the nobles. This is the figure of Queen Hetepheres, the grandmother of Meresank. The costume shows some very strange pointed shoulder details, and this is a unique costume from ancient Egypt. The queen also has blonde hair, which is painted yellow and then lined over with red, and again this is a very rare occurrence. Behind her stands her granddaughter, the owner of the tomb, Meresank II, and she's wearing the funerary costume. You can see the skin of the animal wrapped around the body of the queen, with the head coming around at the side. And behind me again there is another figure of the Queen, Meresank II, and here she's shown in the Old Kingdom costume, the long, narrow dress typical of the period. Her hair is cut very short, and over this she would have worn an elaborate wig, and the name of the Queen appears in the hieroglyphs above her head. Here we've got some very fine scenes of the Queen and her grandmother, again Hetepheres, sailing in a papyrus boat. They're being pushed along by this small figure at the back, and you have the tiny child at the front. At the top of the wall we have a line of bearers bringing offerings to the Queen, and in front of each one you can see a cartouche, and this contains the title of the area or town from which they've come. So they're from different parts of Egypt, all bringing produce to the Queen. This is an interesting scene which turns up in lots of later tombs, and it's the catching of the birds in a big net. The men are pulling the clap net tight, and these, of course, are then going to be prepared. They're taken at the final stage and plucked in and put into baskets. It does have a magical significance as well in the later period. The birds were believed to be enemies of Egypt, symbolise the enemy, so catching them meant power over Egypt's enemies. It's a unique tomb of its kind, and it's particularly interesting because you can tie it to the pyramid, which is virtually outside, the pyramid of Khephren. So here you have a very nice link between the king and the queen, and then eventually, of course, going on into the noble tombs. The people who lived in ancient Egypt believed that the afterlife, in fact, was a replica of this life, but without the problems. So they were trying to recreate the same conditions they'd enjoyed in this life. If a man were high on the social scale, he wanted the same kind of situation in the next world. He wanted all the minions to work on his estate and the power which he had had in this world. So all this is recreated in the tomb, because the idea was that the man, after death, would to the scenes around the walls, and therefore could enjoy these things for eternity. This is the tomb of Ka, who lived in the 6th dynasty, and his titles were Private Secretary of King Pepi II and Priest of the Pyramid of Cheops. There's one statue here on the right where you can see his hair without a wig. And then the others, in fact, have the heavy false hair wig over the top. And again, he's in different costumes. This is his stiffened kilt, which is standing out at the front. And this would be his dress of his office. There's also a small figure, presumably of his child, wearing this plait at the side of the head, which is the so-called sidelock of youth.
Ka's tomb, like many others, contains a false door. Through this, the dead man's spirit re-entered the world of the living to eat food left for him by his descendants. As generation succeeded generation, food was not always left for the dead. To avoid this blasphemy, a list of food and drink, a menu, was written on the walls. This one lists different kinds and quantities of wine, beer, bread, cakes, milk, fruit and vegetables, more than enough for the requirements of the dead man in the afterlife. Ka's son, Idu, is buried near him. He inherited some of Ka's offices and duties. He's seen here receiving tribute. Idu's wife is a tiny figure whom he shelters and who embraces him. Game and cooking pots in the paintings suggest the standard of living that the nobles expected for eternity. The tombs are not the only source of evidence about the lifestyle of the nobles buried at Giza. We even know what their food did to their teeth. Just underneath the Great Pyramid is a hut where their mortal remains are now stored. One of Rosalie David's team is Frank Leake, a dentist and Egyptologist who once examined Tutankhamun's teeth. He has surveyed the collection of skulls and bones in this hut, which an American archaeologist unearthed about 60 years ago.
They came from the mastaba tombs on the west side of the Great Pyramid, and all these people lived about the year 2650 BC. They were the queens of the pharaoh, the royal descendants, the high priests, and court officials. And so they're all of the high social structure of the land of that period, and as such, they can be used for comparative work with other collections. From the skulls, we haven't got very much information. There was one that had obviously died from a wound caused by a sharp weapon, but only one. One or two had diseases of the skull, which was probably due to an ulceration after an injury or something like that. But it is the teeth that give us the most revealing picture of the people of those days. This is the skull of a man aged about 25 to 35. He had very good front teeth, but unfortunately, chewing food with many mineral fragments in them, he wore down the back teeth until the nerve of that tooth became exposed and he got a large abscess above the root of that tooth. He also wore the tooth down, or the one in front, and got a large abscess there. This one died at a much earlier age. It's the skull of a female, and she was she hadn't developed her wisdom teeth, and therefore she was at the age of 16 to 18. She had superb teeth, and she would never have had a moment's trouble with her teeth. Unlike this one, this is a male skull, and he would be between the ages of 30 or 40, probably the lower side of 30 and 40. Unfortunately, he wore his teeth down until the pulps became exposed. Some of the teeth would have had their nerves exposed, but fortunately for them, the tooth laid down what is known as secondary dentine, and that shielded the exposed pulp, and therefore they didn't get an abscess in that tooth. It's only where the pulp is exposed and there's no reaction that an abscess forms. Now, this man probably had an edge-to-edge articulation with his lower teeth, and he wore the crowns down of his front teeth also. And he developed a large abscess underneath the central tooth there, and another large abscess under the tooth there. He also had an abscess on this back tooth here. That abscess of that back tooth penetrated into the sinus, the antrum of Highmore, and from that time onwards he would have had persistent sinus trouble and would have had many a sleepless night.
From Giza to Luxor is about 400 miles. It is on the west bank, opposite Luxor, that we learn most about how ordinary people lived. The modern villages a few miles from the Valley of the Kings still look as they might have looked when Tutankhamun and Seti were alive. The people who lived here were the people who built the king's tombs.
Deir el-Medina is a workmen's village. It was where the families of the workmen lived who were engaged in building and decorating the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, and of course the tombs of the nobles. The living conditions in this community were probably rather similar to that of villages, some villages in Egypt today. Fairly small houses, much of the living done out of doors in fact. You have kitchens and sleeping areas and generally living quarters very similar to the present day. The rubbish heaps of the village were also excavated, and in this there was ample information about the civil, the domestic, the legal business of the community. And they're quite fascinating. We have found out, for example, that the first strike known in antiquity occurred here. The workmen went on strike, held back their labour on the royal tomb because their food rations were delayed, and it was only when the food finally arrived that they were willing to go back to work. Because they were so important, it was so important that the king's tomb was completed, therefore they were able to strike very satisfactorily.
The small reconstructed pyramids once marked tombs. By this time in Egyptian history, everybody wanted to be buried in style.
The tomb of Sennacherib is a very beautiful tomb, and it was built for and decorated for the chief artisan, the head of the workmen. And he obviously took some of the equipment and the workforce from building the royal tombs to provide his own place of eternity. By this time, it was believed that every individual, however poor, had an eternity in the land of Osiris. And we see the great figure of the god Osiris and the islands of Osiris, the paradise, where this eternity would have been spent. Sennacherib is accompanied throughout by his wife, and they are shown in agricultural scenes, as well as coming into the presence of various gods of the underworld.
Even in the afterlife, Sennacherib and his wife did not expect their labors to be at an end. The tools and techniques that they used are almost identical to tools in the Manchester collection. This sickle has a flint blade cemented to the wood. It is 4,000 years since it was last used in the annual harvest. Ploughing with oxen is still carried on in Egypt with fragile wooden ploughs of just this type. Senegen's wife follows humbly behind him, sowing the seed as she goes from a basket in her left hand. Many parts of Egypt are industrial and modernized. But in the Fayoum, where this was filmed, everyday life still echoes the paintings in the tombs and the objects in the museums. The mattock, now with a metal blade, is still a common agricultural tool in Egypt and much of the Middle East. It replaces both the fork and the spade. This artist covered the walls of a great man's tomb with pictures of his workmen. Many of them used mattocks with fragile wooden blades, just like this one found at Kahun village when it was excavated. This is a winnowing flail, to throw the grain up and allow the wind to carry the husks away. In the Fayoum oasis, one of the more remote areas of modern Egypt, the pyramid at Lahun has survived since the 12th dynasty. It was built for Sesostris II. Almost no trace of the nearby village called Kahun can now be seen, though not all of it was ever excavated. It is very rare to unearth the remains of a workman's village. The pyramids survive, but not the houses of the men who built them.
The pyramid is made of a stone core with mud brick, and it would have had a stone casing originally. This has now been lost, and all we see is the interior core of the pyramid. The mud bricks almost certainly would have been made locally, and in the material from Kahun we have a marvellous mud brick mould, which was obviously used for this purpose.
The mud brick factory is less than 5 miles from the pyramid.
This site was excavated by Sir William Flinders Petrie at the end of the last century. The artefacts were taken back from Kahun in the 1890s, and a very substantial proportion of them went to the Manchester Museum because a Manchester textile merchant, Jesse Howarth, had funded Petrie throughout this excavation. So it was the beginning of the Manchester Museum collection.
The objects from Kahun include this flint knife and basket, these building tools, plumb bobs and plumb lines, the toys of the children, including a much-mended leather ball, a little boat, a model hippo, and this tray, shaped like a fish, which once contained the green eye makeup of a lady. At a village very close to Cahun, an old man spins cotton using the ancient techniques. The tools are identical to those used 4,000 years ago and unearthed by Flinders Petrie. This is a sling from Cahun village, once used for hunting small animals and birds. This is one of very few known examples of a fire stick, with a bow to make the stick turn faster and a matrix of inflammable soft wood. Model houses, which are found in some of the tombs, suggest again how the ancient Egyptians lived.
The houses were mainly made of mud, and they were in most cases 1 story but sometimes 2 stories high. They were decorated internally with plaster and painted designs, and they would have been very attractive of their type.
The people of Cahun had the very unusual habit of burying babies beneath their houses in boxes and wrappings of just this sort. No one knows why. They also abandoned everything in their village. The plasterer left his float, he didn't even clean it. The village dancer, her castanets. One theory is that they left the area, that they had perhaps come to it from some other country and returned there. 1 or 2 of the objects found look as if they might have come from the Aegean instead of from Egypt.
The work in Manchester is now centred on the village of Cahun, on the artefacts which came from the village, and various multidisciplinary scientific techniques are being used to try to answer some of the questions which the village poses. And we're carrying out analyses of pottery and the metal artefacts from the village to try and determine if any of these in fact came from abroad. So this should add to our knowledge of the community.
Dr. Bill Newton is the reader in chemistry at Manchester University.
When we've collected enough of the sample, and it's important to get enough so that we can do this multi-element analysis, we have to weigh carefully this powder and mix it with this cellulose powder. The cellulose powder forms a tight pellet, and we put it in the pelleting press together with a fixed amount of cellulose. And by applying a pressure of about 10 tons per square inch, we can demount a pellet of this type. We take these pellets and wrap them in aluminium foils. And having wrapped them, we mark the sample name on the surface. And we do this for 20 samples. We mount these in a special can, together with standards to give us a calibration, and then these are sent away to the reactor, which belongs to the university. When they've been irradiated at the reactor, they come back here, and we demount these pellets, and we have a device whereby we can mount them carefully in these plastic holders. And then these are taken to the counting device to be able to determine the elements in the sample. from this counting, we can actually analyse or determine up to 28 elements. These 28 elements fingerprint the Kahun material. And from this fingerprint, we're able to make some definite objective statements about the source and various characteristics of the Kahun material. This is different than the old techniques used by Petrie himself in the last century, in that it's a much more objective view and much more sophisticated approach to the problem. Enables us to tell whether the Kahun material, well, particularly the clay that was used by the ancient potter to make the Kahun pottery, whether it was all one source material. Hopefully we can then tell whether that source material is local or it came from, or if there were different types of pot, whether these came from different areas around Egypt.
Bill Newton's work allows Egyptologists to make an accurate check on the provenance of any pots which look different from the rest. His preliminary results show very clearly that the clay in these pots came from different sources.
To look at the whole Egyptian problem and put the Kahun material in the context of the whole Egyptian material is, of course, a major project and is a decade of work for several groups in the field. But to look at the Kahun, these 80 samples, will take us something like another 6 to 12 months to complete the project.
Kahun is one of the few places where you find flint tools used side by side with bronze and copper tools. The village was abandoned at the beginning of the Bronze Age, but some of the objects, like this mirror, are very skillfully made. The Manchester project aims to reveal what the inhabitants knew about smelting and using metals.
So, what have we got?
I brought this material from the museum. It's a set of model tools, similar to those you had from Kahun. There's a little mirror.
These are going to be difficult because we can't drill them.
They're fragile, aren't they?
I think I'm going to have to do a little bit of snipping at those. But
Dr. Gordon Gilmore is the activation analyst at the university's research reactor at Risley.
And then there's another mirror for your comparison with the Kahun one, which is, but I think you might find it rather fine for drilling.
Yes, the drill's really quite small, but there's no real problem. I can always just clean the surface off and then use the rasp.
He needs only a very small sample of material to identify all the constituents of a metal. The technique is used industrially as well as for archaeology.
We regularly use it for measuring geological samples, medical samples, industrial samples, just about anything. It's a bit of an unknown technique for most people. Not everybody, of course, has a nuclear reactor, so they tend to use techniques which are around and they can have in the lab. We put the sample in a reactor. This bombards it with neutrons. This makes lots of the elements in the metal radioactive. We then use various detectors, mainly gamma ray detectors, to unscramble the pattern of the gamma rays. We get a list of isotopes, and that tells us what's present in the sample. Appreciate that when a metal is made, there are two aspects to the composition. One is the intention of the person who made it, what sort of an alloy he was making. Was he making a bronze or simply a copper? But then there are trace elements which were present in the ore, and we rather hope that these will be carried on in the smelting process into the metal itself. Then, by looking at these trace elements, we may be able to tell that even if we have two samples, both of which are bronzes, we hope that we'll be able to say that this bronze came from one location, this bronze came from another one.
These pictures of artisans and their activities include men melting and moulding precious metals. Perhaps metalworking was a standard part of the routine on a great man's estate. But what did they know about smelting? Had they started to experiment with alloys and their properties? Copper ore found at Kahun is relatively pure, but most of the objects contain a variety of additives and trace elements, as Gordon Gilmore has shown. Did the men who made this know enough to try and make a chisel harder, or a knife sharper and more likely to keep its edge? A number of objects contain traces of arsenic and tin, which would have made the metal harder. Some of the axe heads contain silver. No one can guess why. It was a very rare metal in Egypt at that time, and it doesn't help an axe to cut through flesh. The Kahun project and the Mummy project run side by side in Manchester. Medical and industrial techniques have been adapted for the purpose. This is the mummy of an unknown child.
We're looking particularly at the wrist because we can take special views of the wrist, and this allows us to compare the appearances of the bone with current bone age charts, and so we can get some idea of the age of the child. What we have done is to angle the X-ray apparatus, and we can also look at the skull sideways on, and this is particularly interesting because we've found that there is evidence of some residual cranial contents. Now, we believe this to be the remains of brain tissue. Staying with this lateral view of the skull, we can see that the bone at the back of the pituitary fossa is intact, and this is of importance because one of the conventional routes of entry for removal of brain tissue resulted frequently in the fracture of that particular piece of bone. Looking at the back of the skull, there's no evidence that this has been used as a point of entry. The bones are complete where the skull joins the spine. The teeth can be quite nicely seen, and he really has very good dentition. All the primary dentition is here, the milk teeth. He hasn't lost any, so this still keeps us with a young child.
Late in Egypt's history, the process of mummification went into decline, but it could still produce almost perfect results. You can even see the colors of this man's beard. Hawks and other animals contained a spark of divinity and were made into mummies. All these have been X-rayed at Manchester Royal Infirmary to make sure that the whole skeleton and everything expected is inside the wrappings. The purpose of mummification was religious, but the process was scientific. Any information about it is valuable. There are only a few thousand mummies left in the world. Many have been destroyed. Anything new that can be learned about them is important, because all of them will deteriorate eventually. This unwrapped mummy is called Asru. Asru was a chantress in the temple of Amun-Re. Asru is on her way to the Manchester Royal Infirmary, where her state of health is being thoroughly researched. The techniques used include endoscopy and radiology. Endoscopy is the insertion of a probe inside the body or wrappings of a mummy to look for traces of tissue and information about the embalming techniques. Dr. Eddie Tapp.
We're introducing this, of course, through the eye so that we go directly into the anterior cranial fossa, and we get quite a good view of the grooves made by the blood vessels in the side of the skull. One can see if there are any abnormalities of those. And then further back we go into the middle cranial fossa, there's quite a lot of resin. I can't actually see any brain tissue, but there's quite a lot of resin that they must have poured into the skull during the mummification process. There are some odd pupae cases as well. Just what date those are, I wouldn't like to say. Just pull it out for a moment to orientate it. Ah, yes, there's quite a large animal here. In fact, it's a beetle. And it's impregnated by some of the resin. So presumably it's been in since...
At the time of...
Yeah,
yes,
since the mummification took place.
Trapped in the resin.
Yes. I don't think that the beetle will come out because it seems to be firmly fixed. So if we close the jaws of that, of course, while we introduce it, let's see if we can manage that. Fine.
You get the jaws to come out and then to close them.
Yeah.
Trapped with them.
I'm a histopathologist. I examine surgical specimens under the microscope, and when Dr. David was gathering a team of people together, she asked me to see if I could find out something about disease in ancient Egypt. But as you say, it's in the jaws to grab it that's the problem. I wasn't, I must say I was very sceptical when she asked me, because the tissues are very hard and dehydrated and hardly the kind of material that we're accustomed to dealing with. Yeah. Okay, yeah, fine. But we have been reasonably successful in examining both normal tissues under the microscope and in finding evidence of disease in them. Okay, now I think if we're going to use the X-rays, we'll have to fasten this up. Yes, just let that go around a little bit further. That should hold her. Okay, I think?
Yes, that's fine.
And now she'll be steady. That's fine. Good. Now, could I have the instrument again, the endoscope? Now, I want to put the instrument in and monitor it on the screen, because I'm interested in an area quite close to the midline where there's collapsed lung tissue. And by putting the endoscope just in that position, I know that if I take tissue from there, I've got exactly the area that I'm interested in. If we use one of these in at least 3 of the mummies that we've examined so far, in fact, in all the pieces of lung that we've examined so far, we've found evidence of sun pneumoconiosis. And this is a condition where you get damage to the lung due to the presence of sand inhaled, presumably during sandstorms. This causes, as I say, damage to the lungs. It is a damage of the lungs very similar to the type that coal miners get and stonemasons get in the present time. It would certainly make them rather breathless. It could, under certain circumstances, put a strain on the heart, and they could develop heart failure as a result of it. But certainly I think the infections, bacterial, viral infections, must have been very common when you consider the kind of conditions that they lived in.
Quite a bit of material inside there.
Yes.
Are there any insects inside?
I can't actually see any insects in here, no. No. You can see the backbone. In fact, having said I can't see any instrument, I have just found one insect, one pupa, again, rather similar to the ones that we've seen inside the skull. That's just resting on her backbone, basically. It's only in the last few years that I've examined histological sections under the microscope of the intestines, and in fact, these show that she has a condition we call strongyloides. This is a small worm which lives in the intestine, You get it, in fact, from walking or moving around in infected water, usually through the soles of the feet. Immature forms of the worm get in there and travel via the veins to the lungs and eventually get in the intestines, where they develop into adult forms, lay eggs, and the eggs are passed out in the usual way, infect water, and the whole cycle starts again.
And again, as we look to the midline, you can see that collapsed tissue.
In general, of course, they didn't suffer from the kind of diseases that we do today. Arterial disease, atherosclerosis, degenerative disease of the arteries was probably relatively uncommon. Therefore, they probably didn't die of heart attacks. They didn't die of strokes in the way that people do today. I think they suffered more from nutritional deficiencies, and certainly they suffered from infections.
Egypt is a timeless, beautiful country. It is difficult not to think that what you see today is what the pharaohs saw. In some cases, this is true. In modern Egypt, you can still find equipment of the sort that was used at least 5,000 years ago. This shadoof is a counterbalanced crane to lift river water up onto the land. It antedates the introduction of the wheel. It was well known before the first camel was seen beneath the pyramids. Even now, when the Aswan Dam has transformed the ecology of the Nile, the shadoof and sailing boats like the felucca are still in common use. To build up a complete picture of how the ancient Egyptians lived and died is almost impossible. Ancient customs have survived in modern Egypt. They tell us something. The landscape and the people look as they always must have. Other things can be learned from the paintings in the tombs. The ancient Egyptians were eternally optimistic about the quality of the afterlife. What they painted was what they hoped to enjoy, a fertile, secluded land, a land of plenty, wealth and leisure. Every symbol of plenty on the walls or ceilings would reproduce itself by magic for the dead rich people to make use of. Everyone who died would be eternally young, eternally amorous, eternally content. It's a wonderful vision, but the physical evidence is different. Most of them died before they were 40. Their bodies were infested with worms and microparasites. The bread wore down their teeth. It is the hard realities of life and death in ancient Egypt that the Manchester Project is beginning to reveal.
Next week, Chronicle goes in search of an Etruscan ship wrecked off the coast of Italy 2,600 years ago. That's next Thursday morning at 11:50 here on BBC Two.